is American Government on Friday, October 9th, 2020. Remember that we're in the middle part of our three-part consideration of the Electoral College. On Wednesday, which I'll summarize in a minute, we looked at the original design and functioning of the Electoral College. Today, we're going to examine the changes in the Electoral College that now determine the present system. And then on Monday, we'll turn to the primary criticisms or issues raised. And of course, that is, should the Electoral College be abolished and replaced with what? Well, we'll see. And so for Monday, that's the Diamond article from the Nichols Reader on the Electoral College. And don't forget that Wednesday is our third midterm, which will include the material on Congress and the PRQs for Congress and the material on the Electoral College. So, what did we learn on Wednesday? That, as I asked you during our Zoom sessions, the presidential election is a three-stage election. This is not the distinction between nomination and election that I made at the beginning of Wednesday's lecture. Rather, the Constitution says, step one, the people choose electors, and that's what you will be doing on November 3rd. And the framers planned that, and again, you'll see that still happens. So, just to remind you, when you step into the voting booth on November 3rd or mail in your ballot, you are not voting for president. You are still voting for electors. The difference is this, as you'll see, that in the original system, you voted for electors and they voted and deliberated and chose the president. More about that in a minute. In the present system, you still vote for electors, but as you're going to see, your popular vote now determines how the electors vote for president. More about that, of course, later. The second stage, set by congressional statute, is the electors meet in their state capitals on the same day, which again by law is set as the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, roughly the second week in December. And sometimes that meeting is reported in the news, sometimes it doesn't. It passes by with most Americans probably being aware of it. But here's the critical thing from Wednesday. Remember, the people choosing the electors didn't vote for an elector because he or she would support a candidate or belong to a party or anything like that. Those things didn't exist. An elector ran on his or her grasp of the issues, his ability to represent the people in his district or her district. And so in some ways, remember, you chose the elector. Then, here's the second stage. The electors met, and what did they do? They did both the nominating stage, generating candidates, talking and spending the day deliberating and trying to decide who would be a good president. And at the end of that same day, when they nominated candidates, that is to say, mentioned nationally prominent individuals who would be a good president, that was the nomination stage. That same day, they finished by taking their two-person ballot, their two-person form that had two slots or names on it, and they both chose for president. As you saw, and from my handout and from the Constitution, the 12th Amendment changed that. Each elector still gets two ballots or two votes, but one is designated president and one is designated vice president. So the third stage was the electoral ballots are collected and sealed, sent to the joint session of Congress, where they are opened by the president of the Senate, the vice president, and then counted. So that's the three stage. Choosing the electors deliberating, nominating, choosing, and voting, and the electoral votes being counted by Congress. That still happens, by the way, except for the middle part, as we'll see. Now, of course, then the potential fourth stage, as we discussed both in my lecture and in the Zoom sessions, is if no single person gets a majority of the electoral votes cast, then the House immediately, the joint session ends, and the House immediately meets and chooses the president, with each state voting as one unit, as one vote, and with a majority of the states choosing the president. And then, of course, the same thing happens with the Senate and the vice president. So, that was the way the system was designed to work, and as you'll see, did work for the first two elections of George Washington. And then the question is, what were the purposes and what were the advantages of such a system? Alexander Hamilton explains that in Federalist 68. And that's selection 22 in the 10th edition of the Nichols Reader called The Electoral College. In essence, I'm going to reduce or suggest, and if you look on the notes, Hamilton suggests 4 basic advantages or purposes of this way of choosing a president. I'll read. Now, he mentions it was desirable and equally desirable. You'll see this is on page 110. I combine these into the same advantage, which I call selective popular choice. Here's what I mean by that. Here's what Hamilton says. It was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom such an important a trust was to be confided. This purpose will be answered by committing the right of it, making it, not to any pre-established body like the Congress, as we discussed in the Constitutional Convention, but to men chosen by the people for a special purpose and at the particular conjuncture. The last phrase meaning at the time when the electors meet in their state capitals. But he goes on. It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station, and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation, and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of people, selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass, will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations. So what do I mean by selective popular choice? Hamilton thinks that the president, and we'll see this when we turn to the presidency in a couple of weeks, there's no question, as we saw from the beginning of the Constitutional Convention up through our consideration of the Constitution, the presidency is clearly the greatest office in the United States. They deliberately created, in other words, contrary to the Articles of Confederation, which tried to have no executive or a weak executive, at the heart of the constitutional system is the separation of powers and checks and balances. But in a way, at the heart of the system, and this is both, I think, by intention of some of the framers, and has certainly been the case in the evolution of our politics, the president is the greatest office on earth. I don't know if they thought it would be the greatest office on earth, but when we look at the formation of the presidency and its growth in a couple of weeks, there's no question. The president of the United States is in some ways the most powerful individual ever to have lived on earth. Just think, every president since World War II has a Secret Service agent who has a briefcase that contains all of the nuclear codes for the several thousand, I think the 2 or so thousand that still remain, nuclear warheads. And don't forget that since the 60s and 70s, our nuclear warheads, our nuclear missiles are MIRVed, multiple entry re-entry vehicle. So each nuclear missile carries roughly 5 thermonuclear warheads, which could, in other words, kill the entire human race over by 55 times, I think it's been estimated. So the person who controls that much power is a pretty powerful office. But that's not the only measure of the president's power. So Hamilton is saying here that given such an important office, he's not certain that the best way to choose the chief officer, the president of the United States, is through a popular contest with popular votes. So the framers weren't certain that the people would be qualified directly to vote for the president. Therefore, he says, but it's important to have the people operate somehow with some choice, some influence on the electors. And that's how they did it. They chose the electors. But then he says, for such an important office, better to have a smaller number of people, more qualified than the general public, under circumstances more deliberative, as we acted out on Wednesday, and leave the choice to that. So this first advantage is the people have a say, but not the final say. Therefore, there's popular input, but it's not finally a popular choice. That has changed, as you see, because by the time we get to the end of today's lecture and we examine the Electoral College on Monday and Diamond's article, today the American people do, in fact, elect the president. More about that on Wednesday. Now, the second advantage, he says, on page 110, it was also peculiarly desirable to afford as little opportunity as possible to tumult and disorder. This evil was not less to be dreaded in the election of a magistrate who was to have such an important agency in the administration of the government as the President of the United States. But the precautions and so forth. By the way, on my notes, I accidentally put this second one, is actually the third one, and so this actually should be less tumult. I assume you know what tumult is. Tumult means excitement, disorder, even violence. Did the founders think that the election of the president could be the occasion of disruption and tumult and disorder throughout the United States? Well, what about the election of 1860, where the presidential election led to the Civil War? What about the election of 2016, in which there was rioting in the streets after President Trump was elected? In other words, the framers knew that in creating such a central and pivotal office, the election for that office might be the basis of tremendously divisive factions among the American people. That has been borne out to some degree. Although, as you'll see when we turn to the party system next week, one of the things the party system does, the two-party system does, is it somewhat both contains and moderates those potentially tumultuous or divisive energies. But how does the original election do that? How does it prevent? Because it divides the electoral energies up into the different elections for electors in the states. Remember, when you voted for elector on Wednesday, you didn't vote for a candidate for president. You were voting for a local elector to represent you in the Electoral College. And don't forget, there is no single meeting of the Electoral College. There are 51 separate meetings today with 50 states and the District of Columbia. So what Hamilton is saying is this system breaks up the concentrated energy of the single presidential election, and so that it both localizes it and then also divides the energy up among different meetings of the electors. So there's less of a chance of a single person election dividing the nation and creating tumult and violence. The third advantage, on the next page, on page 111, and this is what's listed as the second one in my notes, so just remember to switch these around. Nothing was more to be desired that every practicable obstacle should be opposed to cabal. Cabal means a conspiracy, a secret conspiracy, intrigue, and corruption. Here's what that means. I mentioned on Wednesday that one of the critical considerations among the framers when they designed the presidency and the presidential election, they hoped, and they knew that this most powerful office would attract remarkably ambitious individuals. And as you might have been suspected if you lived among the human condition for 5 minutes on Earth, whenever you have ambitious people contending for an office or a single goal, you will probably find the potential for corruption, bribery, all kinds of popular followings, etc. And so, in some ways, what Hamilton is saying is, since there isn't a single presidential election, there are local elections for electors in the states and separate meetings of electors that have no connection with each other. If a corrupt individual is going to try to buy the presidency, it'd be very difficult in this complex system to corrupt all the electors meeting in all the states. So, in some ways, he thought, the framers argued, this would be a system in which the potential for corruption in the presidential election would be dissolved and divided, just like in some ways the potential for tumult and disorder. The last major advantage, he says, is the process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of the president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications, talents for low intrigue, and one of my favorite phrases from the Federalist Papers, the low or the little arts of popularity, may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union. So remember, in this original system, the framers knew people would be interested in the office, but they wouldn't run for the office. The only way that you could make yourself eligible or qualified for the office was if you built up a sufficiently significant national record of achievement so that the serious electors in their different meetings would all basically focus on a kind of a pool of individuals created by their achievements. So they tried to create a process where the greatest office would be filled by the greatest individuals. Has it exactly worked out that way? Well, we'll see. So we turn to the present system. We still have the Electoral College. We still have the three-stage presidential election. You vote on November 3rd for presidential electors. They meet in December and choose the president. Those votes are counted in the joint session of Congress. All that's in the Constitution, that all still happens, but it's clearly a profoundly different process. So let's try to understand how the original Electoral College became the present Electoral College and the present presidential election. What changed? Well, partially and mainly the rise of parties, and I'm going to spend some time trying to explain how political parties developed in our system. Don't forget that in other modern democracies or modern popular governments like Great Britain and on the continent, political parties, what we call modern political parties, began to form around the same time, but for different reasons. So the 12th Amendment changed the original system in ways that you've already seen. Instead of 2 votes for president, each elector has 2 votes still, but 1 for president and vice president. Instead of, if there's no majority, the House choosing from the top 5 candidates, the 12th Amendment reduced it to 3 candidates. And also, there were other changes, like the 22nd Amendment, that limited the president to 2 terms, etc. But the main thing that changed the operation of the Electoral College was the rise of political parties. And as we'll see the nature of that change. And when we turn to Bryce's article at the end of today's discussion, we'll see what effect it had on the race for the presidency. So the system that the framers designed and that we acted out on Wednesday, or rather I acted out by pretending to be 4 different versions of me, worked. That system worked. For the first election of George Washington in 1788, during the Constitution, remember, was ratified by the Ninth State in June of 1788 and July of 1788. So in November of 1788, they had the first elections for Congress and the Senate and the president under the Constitution. The Electoral College met, and then Congress met on March 4th, 1789. And then the Electoral College votes were counted, and George Washington on the first ballot, both in 1788 and in 1792, the second election of George Washington. This system worked great. George Washington probably was the greatest American at that time. He was the leader of the Continental Army that fought for independence. He was revered by almost all individuals in the United States. And along with Benjamin Franklin and probably Thomas Jefferson, perhaps John Adams, Washington was the most famous American in the world. And so the Electoral College chose this great individual to occupy the great office of the presidency in 1788 and in 1792. He was the unanimous choice on the first ballot of both 1788 and 1792. Now, the runner-up under the original system was John Adams, who became Washington's vice president. So, remember, that was the pre-12th Amendment, so it was the runner-up in the second ballot that became the vice president, and that changed the 12th Amendment, as we said. But by the election of 1796, the system began to transform. The major change in the Electoral College and in our whole political system was the development of political parties, which developed in the 1790s during the first decade of our existence. How did this happen? During the 1790s, after the Constitution began to operate as our government, when it was ratified and it was set in place and began to work, obviously, different policies would point the government in one direction or another direction, today as now. And when serious differences of opinion began to develop regarding especially President Washington, and let's be clear, his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who was the driving intellectual force of the Washington administration. Now, don't forget, Washington also knew that Hamilton's political adversary, Thomas Jefferson, who had been in Paris as our ambassador during the Constitutional Convention, but had come home, Washington appointed Hamilton as his Secretary of Treasury and Jefferson as his Secretary of State. He knew, in other words, that these two great individuals were differing in opinions. He wanted to unify the country and have his administration represent every major political faction. Well, it worked for a while, But Jefferson soon became discontented, and he saw that Washington really, I should say that Hamilton had Washington's ear, and that the Washington administration was really the Hamiltonian administration. There's some truth to that. So Jefferson resigned, the Secretary of State, went back to Monticello outside of Spartanburg, Charlottesville, where I got my PhD at the University of Virginia. And you can look up and see on Monticello, the Little Mountain, which actually is one of the highest mountains in that area, and you can see Jefferson's house looking down on you in the valley. So when the Washington administration began to push for the expansion of the national government, for instance, with the first Bank of the United States that we discussed earlier, here's how our present system emerged. First, members of Congress began to organize themselves in opposition to or support of President Washington and Alexander Hamilton's policies. The main organizers of opposition to Washington and Hamilton were, from within the administration, Thomas Jefferson, but James Madison. There were 11 members of the Constitutional Convention who were elected to the first Congress, and James Madison was elected from his congressional district in Northern Virginia, and so he became probably the most powerful intellect in the original House of Representatives. And so Jefferson and Madison began to coordinate opposition to Hamilton and Washington's policies, because of course the president can propose programs and legislation, but of course it's Congress, as you know from Article 1, Section 1. It's Congress that actually has the legislative power of the United States. Second, as public opinion in the country began to react to Washington's policies and the inevitable crises of national life, people began, as people do, to call themselves and others names. I'm sure you have, in your experience, called somebody else a name, and you may have actually applied a name to yourself. These names began to stick as shortcut ways of identifying people by their political opinions and activities. They became what we would today call party labels. The supporters of Washington and Hamilton's policies took over the name of the supporters of the Constitution during the ratification debate. Remember, the two parties during the ratification struggle, those who supported the ratification of the Constitution and those who opposed the Constitution and supported the Articles, were called Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So Washington and his supporters began to call their policies Federalist because they argued that they had the proper interpretation of the new Constitution. Now, that was a perfectly good name for a party. And because the suggestion was we supported the Constitution and we support the proper interpretation of the Constitution. The opponents of Washington and Hamilton, such as Jefferson and Madison, couldn't, of course, call themselves anti-federalist. That name wouldn't make any sense because it would mean opposition to the Constitution. That was now the official and working form of government. So the name that several names began to circulate for the opposition party. The most common one was Republicans, on the grounds that the Washington and Hamilton policies would take the Constitution in a monarchical or an aristocratic form. But it was supposed to be a Republican form of government, as Madison describes in Federalist 10, as you remember. And so the opponents to the Washington-Hamilton policies began to call their opposition Republican, sometimes Democrat, sometimes a hyphenated Republican Democrat. Obviously, those names stuck eventually, as we'll see. But by the end of the 1790s, and even by the election of 1796, there was a clear-cut set of individuals. People throughout the country were calling themselves either Federalists or Republicans. Members of Congress were beginning to organize in caucuses called Federalist and Republican. And finally, by 1796, John Adams was elected as a Federalist president. But as it turns out, because of the two ballot system for president, the runner-up was Thomas Jefferson. So Adams was a Federalist president who had a Republican, Thomas Jefferson, vice president. But by 1800, party had pretty much gotten its hooks both into the people who began to organize themselves and call themselves by party labels. But as you're going to see, the major change was in the people running for office. Now you had candidates running for office. And you had candidates, as you'll see, applying party labels to themselves. So third, if you're following the notes, candidates for office began to run for office, declaring what kind of policies they would support or oppose, and which leaders they supported or opposed, contained in the above party labels. The natural organizing force of presidential elections. Because, again, as we read from Federal 68 from Hamilton, the framers knew that once they created this great office, that it would attract more and more energy of the nation as the office expanded and grew. They anticipated that. And so there's no question that the presidential election in our system, of all the 57,000 electoral offices that the federal, state, local, municipal, and national government have, remember, we mentioned when we were talking about federalism, that one of the great advantages of federalism is that it divides power up. One of the reasons Americans, when we turn to the party system in elections next week, one of the reasons Americans may have a relatively low rate of participation in voting compared to other modern democracies or republics is because we ask Americans to vote so frequently and on so many offices. But at any rate, there's no question that the presidential election is that electoral event that energizes and organizes most people's electoral identities and efforts. So, as the presidency grew, the focus of the political system began to direct the country's attention to the next election and who might be available as a possible president, which would steer the country's policies. Fourth, and this is the critical change in the Electoral College. By the third presidential election of 1796, electors began to identify themselves to voters with party labels, indicating for whom they would vote as electors. And in the election of 1800, the fourth presidential election, we had a new system in effect. Electors began to vote by party during their electoral college meetings that occur after the people vote. So listen very closely and look at the notes. What disappeared was that day of deliberating, arguing, nominating, and voting. What replaced it, and what still occurs today in our present electoral system, is electors now simply meet and they act as pre-programmed voting machines, registering the popular votes of the people who elected them. Now, in my handout, as you'll see, I explain how that works. I'm going to repeat that a little bit, but here's the point. No longer do the electors, as in the original system, nominate and elect. As we're going to see, one way of putting the development was parties began to form, and now parties do the nominating stage of electors. All electors do, since they run on party labels and vote by party labels, is all electors do is vote according to the popular party vote in their states. So to explain that, fifth, and this is the last development that leads to our present electoral college system. By the 1820s, and by the way, what happened, and as we'll see when we do the history of the party system, by 1800, the Federalist Party was all but voted out of office and disappeared more or less. And so by 1800, the U.S. became a one-party state almost, with the Republican parties on all levels of government. And that dominated the country up until the 1820s and 30s. By then, there was kind of an opposition to the Democratic Party because the Republican Party had switched its name by the time that Andrew Jackson was elected in 1828 to the Democratic Party. So and that was the only party more or less. But there was some beginning opposition to begin formed on things like tariffs and slavery. And the opposition party was called for about a decade and a half the Whig Party. By the 1850s, the main issue in the country had become slavery and anti-slavery, and so two parties formed by the 1850s called the Democratic Party, which, of course, in the Illinois senatorial election and Lincoln-Douglas debates was represented by Stephen Douglas, and in the on the other side was Abraham Lincoln, running as a senator. By 1860, the Republican and Democratic parties essentially became our two parties that still organize our elections today. So, by the 1820s, states began to adopt what we call the winner-take-all system, which I explain in my handout, or the unit system. What does it do? It pools all of a state's electoral votes into a single slate or a single vote. Remember, in the contingency election in the House, when if there's nobody gets a majority of Electoral College votes and it goes to the House, what the Electoral College does, as we'll see on Monday, is it treats each state as a single unit. Therefore, all of the state's electoral votes are treated as a single vote, just like in the House of Representatives, when representatives choose the president, but as a state, where each state gets one vote. Keep that in mind as we try to understand the dynamic of the contemporary Electoral College and the proposals for abolishing it or reforming it that we'll discuss on Monday. So, the way this works is whichever party wins the plurality. Now, let's be clear. Here you have to understand the difference between a plurality and a majority. A majority means 50% plus one. If you have a majority of votes, then by definition, the rest are a minority. But in a plurality simply means the most votes. If you have, say, in a congressional district, 6 individuals running for a representative from a representative district, a congressional district, there can only be one winner. These are sometimes called single-member districts, which we'll look at more in the Wilson text when we talk about the parties and campaigns. A single-member district means you have an election where you can only have one winner. Most American elections are like that, although some people are proposing to choose that with what's called rank voting or at-large voting. So, with a single-member district like a congressional district, you can only have one winner. If you have 6 people running for office, the likelihood of a single person getting a majority is not impossible, but you'll probably have a breakdown of votes like 43%, then 38%, 20%, 15%, and then whatever. Whoever wins the most votes, even if it isn't a majority, is the plurality, becomes the winner. So the winner-take-all system for the Electoral College takes the plurality, whichever candidate or party wins the most popular votes in the state, they get to send their slate of electors to meet as that state's Electoral College. So how does this work? The electors now vote automatically by party, and the party that wins the popular vote, the plurality, as I just said, in a state is the party that chooses that state's electors. As I explained in the handout, each party running for office for all offices in a state typically have primary elections for candidates for president and other offices in the spring, but then each party that runs candidates in that state, like for instance, in many elections in South Carolina over the last 40 years, you've had sometimes as many as 6 parties running candidates: Democrat, Republican, the National States Rights Party, the Socialist Workers Party, the Green Party, the Reform Party, etc., the Libertarian Party. So each party in each state has a convention in the spring where they do their formal nominating. Among that nominating, they choose party regulars, party activists, party faithfuls who will serve as that state's electors if that party wins the plurality of popular votes. So, who are these people again? As I mentioned, they're not. It's an honor to be a presidential elector, and these are people who've been active in the party, identify with the party, and are almost certainly likely to vote for that party's nominated presidential candidate. But not always, as we'll see. In 2016, 7 Democratic electors from 3 different states did not vote for Hillary Clinton. 5 Republican electors did not vote for Donald Trump. 2 were in Texas, and I forget where the other 3 are. So, but generally speaking, of all the thousands of electoral votes that have been cast since this system took place, only a handful of electors have not been true to the popular vote in their state. So the critical thing is, in today's Electoral College system, whichever party candidate wins the plurality of the popular vote, whether it's 20%, 30%, 44%, and most presidential candidates, by the way, even on the national level, when they tally all the popular vote, very rarely earn more than 50%. Most presidents in our history have been plurality popular vote candidates. More about that on Monday. So, when you step into a voting booth on November 3rd and you see in South Carolina and in North Carolina and most states, all you'll see is the president's name, the candidates' names, and their party affiliation. You'll see Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Republican. You'll see Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Democrat. And probably in South Carolina, there'll be 2 or 3 other candidates, the Reform Party and a Libertarian Party candidate. You're voting for the party that will send its electors to Columbia, the 9 electors who nominated by that party. Your vote for president will determine which party's electors get to meet. And here's the point then. Once they meet, they already have programmed how they vote. Your popular vote, by choosing their party, programs how the electors will vote in your state capital. Whether it's the 9 people in Columbia, the 15 people in Raleigh, the 25 people in Tallahassee, Florida, the 36 people in Austin, Texas, or the 55 people in Sacramento, California. So, as a result, we now have an electoral system which, although it still follows the rules in the Constitution, behaves very differently from what the framers intended. In particular, in today's system, the party is now the nominating institution. The party is the part of our political system that now nominates candidates, and especially organizes the presidential race. They provide candidates under their party label. They run campaigns, and they provide labels that direct voters and electors. So, the critical thing is the nomination stage in the original meeting of the electors, where electors met, nominated, deliberated, and voted, is now that nomination stage has now moved prior to the general election, and that's the role that our parties play, as we'll see next week. The second thing is we now have a system where, strictly speaking, the people actually do elect the president. What I mean by that is, remember, what determines how electors vote is how the people in their state, what party they voted for, who the most votes in that state got on a party level. So that means that since electors automatically now vote by their party label, once you vote in November and choose which party gets to send its electors to the meeting of the Electoral College in your state, the people's vote, it really is the people choosing the president. I hope now, if you don't understand that, you must speak up and ask when we do our Zoom sessions. Now, we'll explore this more on Monday and what it would really mean to abolish the Electoral College or reform it. And in favor, as you'll see, the most prominent reform or replacement would be a national direct popular vote. That's what we'll talk about on Monday. So, as a result, that's how we now elect the president. It follows the same rules in the Constitution, but it's interesting. Same rules, but the system operates completely different in the 2 ways that I just summarized. So, remember, Hamilton says, and the framers hope, that their system of electing the president would elect only the greatest individuals with the most extensive reputations and qualifications for the greatest office in the country. As we like to say in today's English, how's that working for you? And in Roman numeral 4, I raise that question. Ever since we have the system we have that evolved in the 1820s, do great individuals win the presidency? You might get some hint from the title of the selection from James Bryce's work, published in 1880. Let me talk a little bit about that. James Bryce was an Englishman. It so happens, interestingly enough, that the 2 greatest books on American politics in America that have ever been written were written by 2 foreigners who came to this country and visited. Bryce was the British ambassador to the United States, but the other individual whom we will read some parts of, was Alexis de Tocqueville, a French aristocrat who came to this country for 9 months as a young man in 1830, spent 9 months here, traveled around, and then went back to France and wrote a massive 800-page book on America called Democracy in America. Now, when I teach American political thought in the spring, I focus on that book because even though that book is now almost 150 years old, if not more, almost 200 years old, it's still the greatest and most perceptive book on American politics and American life ever written. The second one was James Bryce's The American Commonwealth, which he wrote when he went back to Britain about American politics, etc., as he observed it from a British point of view. In this selection in the Nichols Reader, you can tell what he thinks about the election system because it's entitled Why Great Men Are Not Elected President. In it, Bryce argues that since the presidential election is now a popular contest and a party contest, great people are not attracted to that process. And you'd have to ask yourself the question. I'm not going to answer this for you, but I'll ask it for you. Of the 45 individuals who have occupied the office of the presidency since the founding of the republic, how many of them have really met the standard of greatness? Now, by the way, I also teach a course on the presidency, and ever since the 1960s, historians, political scientists have been doing this interesting process of ranking and rating the presidents from best to worst and in 5 categories: great, near great, middling, bleh, poor, and failed. For your information, most historians and political scientists consider the greatest president. And by the way, let me just say, typically about 5 presidents are rated as truly great. Guess who? Most historians and political scientists believe that Abraham Lincoln, and I agree with this, was our greatest president. Second was George Washington. Third, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Fourth, Teddy Roosevelt. And then fifth, it tends to be either Thomas Jefferson or Woodrow Wilson. It depends. Some go up and down. That's only 5 out of 45. The worst presidents, by the way, tend to be James Buchanan, who was Lincoln's predecessor, and who is, in essence, as the country fell apart, said, I can't do anything about this. The second one is Warren Harding, who was considered to be one of the most ineffective presidents and who let corruption reign under him, and or Richard Nixon, who had to resign the presidency. So, in 1880, Bryce argues that only a few presidents, and in fact, as we just saw, probably only a tiny few, can really qualify as really having been great. Again, the next category that historians and political scientists create is like near great, and in that category are presidents like Eisenhower, Harry Truman, perhaps Ronald Reagan, etc. Most presidents obviously fall somewhere in the middle range, and don't forget, the word for middle is mediocre, and then poor and failed. So, why does Bryce think that the new transformed presidential electorate system doesn't elevate great people? First of all, he says, because it's organized by parties, parties want to win. So as a result, parties tend to nominate candidates who don't necessarily possess the greatest qualities, but possess the greater likelihood of winning the presidential election. You could say, when you look at our electoral politics, both recent and not so recent, that's probably true. Parties want to win offices so that they can control government. That's the way party competition works. So Bryce argues that means that parties tend to nominate safe, not great, but safe candidates. Second, he says, since it's a popular contest, let's be clear. What Hamilton calls the little arts of popularity, and if you've watched a television commercial, a political commercial, you understand these are not PhD dissertations. They're pretty simplistic, often emotionally laden, with distortions and cartoon-like presentations of themselves and their opponents. What Bryce says is, in popular contests, it's not necessarily greatness. First of all, popular contests are messy. If you've ever run for an office, you know you have to sell yourself. Some people love doing that. But on the other hand, it's kind of demeaning. And so Bryce says great individuals often have too much of a sense of honor to debase themselves in a popular contest. Moreover, he says, what appeals to most people is not greatness, but what he calls magnetism. What he means by that is what we today call charisma. So the more charismatic or personable or likable a candidate is, the more likely he or she is likely to be elected. So instead of the system of automatically, as Hamilton says, a moral certainty of elevating just the greatest characters, we now have a system that tends to advocate party hacks and mediocre but charismatic individuals. Whether or not you agree with that, you'll have to take my presidency course to see how the nation has fared. But at any rate, you'd have to say we have a completely different system, even though it follows the same constitutional rules, for electing the president than what the framers designed. And as a result, while a great individual can be elected to the president, that is not the likely tendency of our system. Now, by the way, when we turn to the question of reforming or abolishing the Electoral College and say replacing it with a national direct popular vote, you have to ask yourself the question, would that necessarily improve the quality of the outcome? Would a national direct popular election trend to favor the elevation of great individuals to the presidency? Or would it simply be more of the same? We'll see that on Monday.